what I do full time now, and it started from the idea that, well, we know that people are lazy, and we know ourselves we're quite lazy, and essentially what we wanted to do was turn your smartphone into a remote control for everything. We started by turning your smartphone into a remote control for your computer. So the idea behind my talk today is to go through the design and how we approached multi-platform development in terms of this project. I won't go very much into the details about like how Unified Remote works, but just so everyone knows, it's an app that you install on your smartphone, piece of software that you install on your computer, and essentially they talk over Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, and then you can control your computer from your phone. So yeah, I'll start by going through a brief history of Unified Remote from a design and multi-platform point of view. And then second half, I'll get a bit more into my thoughts on multi-platform development. And if anyone has any questions or any thoughts, feel free to interrupt me. Yes, disclaimer, neither me or my co-founder are designers. So this is actually a very unique time for you guys to have a look at some really old screenshots. I'm not proud of them, but it's a fun part of the history. So yeah, version 1 looked like this. And I don't know, maybe some of you guys will recognize like this is what Android used to look like. This was very much us just like putting something together. A good thing about this, though, was since we started with Android, we were basically forced to start by building an app that was responsive, since you could not guarantee that you were building an app for a phone that always had the same screen size. So I think if I was going to pick out something that I was proud of, it was that it was actually kind of responsive. The bad thing about this design, though, was that essentially everything that you see here was hard-coded into the app. So, the layout for this remote control for your browser or the media remote control or the power remote control, everything was hard-coded into the app itself. When we released this app, we got a lot of good feedback. A lot of people said they wanted more remotes. They want to control more things. And we also got quite a few people that requested more apps. So they wanted, hey, why don't you guys release an app for iOS? Or why don't you release an app for Windows Phone? So from quite early on, we had to think about this. If we want to support more platforms in the future, how are we going to be able to reuse the remote controls? Since they were hard-coded into the app itself, we didn't want to re-implement each remote control for each platform. So, for example, when we released an iOS app or a Windows Phone app. So I think this is the most technical slide I have. Basically, the ingenious idea we came up with was put all the logic in here, come up with some standard language to make the phone and computer be able to talk to each other, and then synchronize the data. So let's build a remote control for Spotify or YouTube or whatever on here. The app can just sync. And that way, if we, in the future, decide to release a new app, well, the logic is here. So we just have to build a new front end for the app itself. Another thing we had to think about was, so if we want to design these remote controls, how are we going to make sure that what we design is going to look good on all platforms? We essentially want to make sure that we can design it, maybe testing on Android, but we want to make sure it looks good and works on iOS and Windows Phone as well. So one of the early things we decided on doing was to introduce the idea of a grid system, to have something that was quite uniform and that we could adopt across all platforms. And it was quite simple. Basically, we just split up the screen into a grid. We had some simple markup, very much like HTML, that described, here's the grid, has this many rows. On each row, we have some buttons or some slider or whatever. So we did a lot of work. I think a year later, we were still studying. We released our version 2 app, which, as you can see, looks quite different. I'm still not very proud of it, of the design itself. But as you can see, it's still very much like Android feel. It wouldn't really go well to have this style on iOS, for example. The good thing about it was that adopting this sort of grid system made it a lot easier for us to add new functionality. So we added lots of new remote controls, and all of that we could do for the PC software, and then it could just sync across to the app itself. So whenever we wanted to release a new remote, we didn't have to actually change anything in the app. We just had to make sure the app supported all the controls and the layout system. We got quite a good feedback here. As always, some people love what you do, and some people are going to hate what you do. So one of the really hard lessons we learned early on was, whatever you do, people are going to hate it. There are always going to be haters. So you just sort of have to roll with that. You have to accept that, especially when you first release something, people are going to hate what you do. But wait until that goes over, and then hopefully you have the nice people still using your app. So now we had this Android V2 app that was working pretty well. And both me and my co-founder said, okay, well, let's try to actually release another app. So we decided to start with a Windows Phone app. And I'm sure some of you guys are going to wonder, why did we decide to do Windows Phone instead of iOS? For us, it was quite simple. We weren't Mac users. We didn't have iPhones, so obviously that would be a big cost for us. We were still students. Objective-C just looks horrendous. So I was just don't want to get into that. And both me and my co-founder, we had used C# and Visual Studio quite a lot, which is what Windows Phone uses. So yeah, it was a pretty easy choice. And one of the first things we had to think about was, okay, well, if we want to release an app for Windows Phone, are we going to build a new native app, or should we go down the whole wrapped multi-platform framework? And this was quite a few years ago. So for us, we looked at what was available, and we came to this conclusion that what was out there wasn't really appealing. Most of the solutions that were there were quite limited in the features. So, our app was quite heavy. It had a lot of functionality. It used a lot of networking and all integrated with a lot of features in Android. So most of the solutions that were out there were pretty much just like, hey, do you have an app where you want to show some information? Well, yeah, that didn't really work for us. The apps that were out there that use these things generally felt quite clunky and slow. I'm sure you guys all remember the old Android app for Facebook, which was just awful. And we had also already invested quite a lot of time in the Android app, so we didn't feel like just throwing that away and starting with something new. So instead, we went with the idea that we want our apps to feel native, we want them to be native, but we want to maintain a consistent look and feel across all the platforms, which is sort of our unified remote brand. In terms of what we wanted to split here, it was quite simple. We said all the core app features should be native. So anything that has to do with the actual design of how you... So anything that had to do with the actual design of how you navigate around in the app, the menus, the settings, all of that stuff we wanted to be native. Anything that was OS specific, so anything that was specific for Android or Windows Phone, of course that should be native as well. But everything that was supposed to be cross-platform, so in our case, the remote controls, we wanted to make sure we only had to implement those ones, work everywhere, and that we could design them on one platform and have them work on the other platforms as well. So we actually managed to get our Windows Phone app out quite quickly. The downside with Windows Phone back then and still is that the market share is quite small. But actually the tools are really good. And especially if you're trying to port an app from Android to Windows Phone, it's surprisingly easy to do that in terms of actually converting Java code to C#. A lot of the core logic in our app, like all the networking and communication protocols and that stuff, it was almost at the level where we could just copy the code over from Java, convert some library calls, and it pretty much worked. So that was actually surprisingly easy. Of course, in terms of the visuals, we adopted the tile design that Windows Phone has. But we used the same grid layout, so that was pretty easy to get working. We actually managed to get the app out there in just a couple months over the summer. The grid layout works really well for us and the whole syncing of the data and things like that. But again, not very many users. So once we put out the Windows Phone app, we started thinking, okay, well, maybe we should overhaul our Android app a bit, just make the apps look a bit more consistent. So then we released our version 3 app, which had quite a lot of changes. Obviously Android evolved with starting to get into the material design and things like that. We adopted the tile system on Android as well, which we still think works pretty well. Obviously it doesn't look Android, but when everything else is native, it still works pretty well because the user knows this is an Android app, but this is the content, sort of like a web browser. The browser itself is native, but the page you're looking at is obviously cross-platform. And once we've done that, we actually started to think, okay, let's get into iOS. And we didn't actually do that ourselves, or we semi-did it. We had a summer intern, a student that helped us out with that, which was pretty good because he had some background in iOS. We really didn't, so it was sort of both of us learning at the same time. I thought this app looked really good, and this is pretty much how it still looks today. The downside was that it was much more effort to actually convert the core logic of the app from Java or C# to Objective-C. So it took quite a few months to get this out there, but in terms of the design, it worked really well. Again, the app looks very much native, but then we have this consistent cross-platform remote control design that pretty much now looked exactly the same across all platforms. And this is actually the latest version, 3.5, which has had some minor visual tweaks, adopted more of the material design guidelines from Google. But again, we have the same native look and feel of the app. Everything with the navigation is native, but the content for the remote control is all cross-platform. So this was our family of apps, 3 apps, and all work pretty well, and we have a system that worked pretty well in terms of adding new features. So now, to add another dimension to this, obviously we had our app, but then we had the software running on your computer as well. So then we started thinking, okay, can we start supporting Mac and Linux? Because obviously over the years we received quite a lot of requests for that. So then we basically had to do a complete rewrite of the server software as well. But this was actually the first time we rewrote the server software, and from that point on, we decided, okay, we're only going to make sure it works completely cross-platform. And this made sense because the server that runs on your computer is not necessarily something you interact with. It's just a program that sits in your tray and it just runs. So we went from having developed that in C# to doing everything in C++. We use an amazing cross-platform application development framework called Poco, which basically has everything you need in terms of networking, file system, you name it. You have really nice classes for doing cross-platform C++ development. They don't have user interface stuff, but that's not really their focus. We introduced a new script engine so that our remote controls could use the power of Lua. And in terms of the things you actually had to interact with, so a simple manager, some settings, we went down the web-based route for that. So that's all web-based manager that opens up, uses some JavaScript. And yeah, so now all of a sudden we could support Windows, Mac, Linux, and even cross-compile it for Raspberry Pi, Arduino, and lots of other things. So yeah, that was a brief history of Unified Remote itself. So yeah, it supports pretty much 6 major platforms today, and we're a team of 2 doing all of this. Now I just want to go through some of my thoughts on cross-platform development. Maybe some of you guys are considering getting into app development. Maybe some of you guys have an app for one platform, but are thinking about what should I think about when getting into other platforms? So just in general, like getting started, I think Android is obviously very simple to get into. It's a very small cost. It's just a one-time $25 cost to get in. Super easy to sign up, and the actual verification process for releasing a paid app is quite straightforward. iOS is obviously a bit more expensive. You have to pay a yearly fee. And actually, one of my biggest criticisms to iOS is that if you're enskild firma, a sole proprietor, you don't have a big, large company behind you, you can't actually publish an app, a paid app, under a different name. So you have to publish an app under your personal name, which I think looks kind of bad. We didn't actually run into this problem for Unify Remote, but I've been playing around with some other apps that I just wanted to get out there quite quickly, and I didn't want it to say like app by Philip Bergqvist. It just doesn't look that professional. And the verification process is a bit longer. In terms of development environments, I think iOS is probably one of the strongest here. The big advantage for Android is that all the tools are cross-platform. So you can work on your Windows or your Mac to do your Android development, even Linux. However, the tools are quite clunky and slow. We don't have to use Eclipse anymore, but now we have Android Studio, but it's still, it's not up there. And the biggest issue with Android right now is that they don't have a proper simulator. So any testing you do, you either have to run on a physical device, which is the best option, or you have to use their really super slow emulator. In terms of publishing and updating your apps, as everyone probably knows, on Android it's pretty simple. You push out your update and it pretty much propagates in a couple hours. Whereas on iOS, you do have to go through the whole waiting process, which it does kind of suck, especially when you just want to get something like a small fix out there and just have that be done quickly. But sometimes you have to wait up to a week to actually get a fix out there. So it's just a bit more of a pain. And we've run into some really strange stuff where, so for example, we have a remote control in our app for Google Music. So obviously in the description of our app, we mention the word Google. But Apple doesn't really like that you mention their competitors in the description of every app. So we actually released an update once and, oh, we noticed that you mentioned Google. Yeah, better luck next time. So then we had to go through the whole process of actually explaining to them, no, it's legitimate. We have a remote control for Google Music. So it's the whole politics of that. Again, we don't use Windows Phone that much, so I can't speak too much to that. But in the past, it's worked out pretty well. It's been a couple days, I think, to get an app out. In terms of payments and reporting, Android is really good here. We pretty much get our money every month on the same day. Apple, however, likes using their own calendar, what I call Apple time. And I don't know, I think it has something to do with how their financial months are reported. But basically, 1 month we might get one payment, and then maybe the next month we'll get payments for 2 months, and then the next month we won't get any payment at all. So it's just, I don't really know how they came up with that system, but yeah, it's kind of wacky. All the reporting tools in terms of looking at your figures, you're getting your payment information, it's all pretty good, except Windows Phone. I feel their stuff has always been kind of slow. I don't know if it has something to do with Microsoft stack, but it just takes a long time to log in. Just to mention some quick DevOps stuff, we heavily use a service called App Annie, which basically just aggregates all your downloads and rankings in one place, which is really good when you're dealing with multiple platforms, because then you don't have to log into every single system to check your rating. Another really good thing with App Annie is that it actually crawls the different stores and can tell you how you're ranked in all the different categories in basically all countries, which is really good, because otherwise you basically have to go into the Play Store or the App Store and scroll until you find your app, which is never fun. And in terms of continuous integration, we've try to automate as much as possible in terms of actually building and deploying our apps, mainly because those processes can be a bit tedious sometimes in terms of packaging the app and making sure they're signed properly and all of this. The only real downside there is that we've managed to automate everything on one Linux VM, except for the Mac and iOS stuff, because that has to be built on a Mac. So again, we have a Mac in our office dedicated for building the iOS app and the Mac server app. So if anyone has any other suggestions there, please let me know. Also, we've been trying to find like a cloud-hosted solution for this, like a cloud-hosted Mac that we can just like use as a build server. And yeah, I honestly don't know how like bigger companies deal with this stuff, because it just seems ridiculous that you can't have a good system for this. In terms of analytics, Amplitude is something we started using quite recently. They have a pretty good free plan nowadays, which is I think 10 million events for free. It's really good in terms of building funnels, looking at your retention, segmenting users, all this stuff, and they have a pretty snazzy interface. And of course, Google Analytics we use across all the platforms. All right, so in terms of how we actually maintain our apps, we sort of see the Android app as our flagship app. It's the one that we release monthly updates for. It's by far the most advanced in terms of features of all our apps. iOS, since neither me or my co-founder are like big iOS guys, we don't use iPhones. It just tends to become a bit more like, we'll release an update when we have some bugs to fix. And Windows Phone is, I don't think we've released an update for over a year. I'm surprised it still works. But essentially the biggest problem we've had there was, so we released the Windows Phone app when it was Windows Phone 7, and then Microsoft came and said like, oh, now we have Windows Phone 8, and it basically means you have to rewrite your entire app. It's like, okay, great. And then we started thinking, okay, maybe we should do that, and then, oh, but wait, Windows 10 comes out, and now they have a completely different system for doing universal apps. So we've sort of on purpose held off on doing too much there, because now we're actually at a point in time where it would make sense to rewrite the entire Windows Phone app and make a universal app out of that, which will essentially mean we can target Windows Phone, Windows 10, and all the new stuff with Connect and HoloLens and things like that as well. So that is on our to-do list for future. One thing I do want to touch upon is obviously the process that we've gone through has very much been a long process. I'm sure if we were starting out today, we would definitely have done things differently. In terms of building the apps, there are some really cool frameworks out there now. Xamarin, I haven't looked into detail, but from what I can tell, they have some pretty good support for actually building native feeling apps, but still being able to do it cross-platform. So that's definitely something I would have liked to get into, maybe still to look into for future updates. In terms of the server software, when we decided to switch over to C++, Node.js had not really become what it is today. I know I was actually debating about, should I do this in C++ or Node.js? We chose C++ just in terms of maturity. Now I sort of wish we'd gone down the Node.js route because, I'm completely in love with Node.js. I do everything in Node.js now. And it would have made it pretty easy for us to make a cloud-based solution for our server. So rather than having to install some software on your laptop, you could bridge the connection over some cloud system. In terms of the remote controls themselves, today those are built with, as I said, Lua, and you have a simple markup with XML to design the layout. It's very much like HTML and some JavaScript, but just in terms of simplicity, we decided to roll our own. Now, if I was going to do it again, I'd probably just adopt JavaScript for the logic, just use HTML for designing the remote controls, and that would make styling a lot easier because we could just use CSS. And again, it would just make the whole thing more multi-platform. So there are definitely things I wish we would have done, but it's always like that. You look back and you wish you could have done things differently. But in terms of actually how our apps work today, it does work well, because since we set up the system where the remote controls are updated and developed in the servers themselves, we are constantly still releasing updates for the server. And even though we haven't updated our Windows Phone app in maybe a year, that still gets updates and things still work, which is quite cool, actually. So I just also want to quickly touch upon my future. So right now we're at a point where we've been dealing with consumers for the past 5 years, and both me and my co-founder are just kind of tired of people. So we're sort of feeling, maybe we should go down the B2B route instead. Right now we're both also quite nervous about the whole App Store stuff. Unified Remote is our complete income. It's what we live off right now, which is amazing. But it does also feel like you're living in the hands of Google and Apple. Any day, things could change, and they're not going to look out for us. Like, that's not going to be their number one priority. You see a lot of things happening, especially with content creators in YouTube, and Google changing things. So it's always in the back of our minds, like, what's going to happen tomorrow? What's Google and Apple? What's up their sleeves? So it is a bit frustrating not being in control of the whole cycle of selling your product. You are in the hands of Google and Apple, so that does make us a bit nervous sometimes. And we have been struggling a bit with actually scaling our product even more. I should say that it is a very well-received app. We're one of the top apps on Android primarily. We're just about to hit 5 million downloads and just gone over 200,000 customers. So it has been a really successful thing for us. But lately we've been trying to figure out what can we do to actually make this accelerate more, and it's been kind of tricky. So we just recently started a new project which we're calling Spies.io, which essentially came out of our own problems with running an app company, which was we use a lot of different services. Like I mentioned, App Annie, Jenkins. We use Zendesk for support. We use I think probably 15, 20 different services to just run our operation. And the tricky thing that we always felt was, how do we actually become more data-driven? How do we actually consume all this data and make decisions from the data? So we, as any developers do, you quickly browse online. It's like, nothing's perfect. And then we just said, let's build our own. So we started with a simple dashboard solution. Now it's turned into a pretty advanced time-based analytics tool. But we're very much focusing on how can we build a system that's super easy to use. It should essentially just be click to integrate the services and start collecting your data and start using that data to make decisions in your company. And I really hope that I can come back and talk a bit more about the technical things on how we're building that, because that's all web-based. It's completely developed in Node.js, and we're using a front-end framework called Reactive.js, which is quite similar to, or it has the same mindset as React, and it's been working pretty well for us.